Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest Ask the Experts. Hope you all are well and safe. Today's topic certainly doesn't need a whole lot of introduction, but it's going to be on the election and an update on the election. This is actually a continuation from last month where we had pre-election, and now we're going to be doing a post-election. I'm really thrilled to have a great panel of Chapman faculty with the diverse backgrounds that I think you're going to find really interesting. As many of you know, this is an interactive format where we're going to have a conversation with the experts, but we really want you posting interesting questions for them to respond to also. So there's a Q&A portion in there for you to post those questions, so certainly do that. I just realized I didn't introduce myself also, but I'm Tom Piechota, the Vice President for Research here at Chapman. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a great moderator today. She's Dean Jennifer Keene, who's a professor of history and also the Dean of the Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. She's also a well-published expert on American history, including the 1918 pandemic. So with that, I will turn it over to Dean Jennifer Keene.
Great, thanks so much, Tom. I'm so pleased to be able to moderate this panel today. I think we're going to have a really engaging conversation over the next hour, helping us sort of digest what we've all witnessed and experienced over the last week or so. And we've got some good questions, but we also will want your questions. So as the conversation unfolds, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask the panelists, your questions. So I'll begin by introducing who we have today with us, and then we'll turn right to the conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce Lori Cox-Hahn, who is a professor of political science in Wilkinson College. Her research and teaching expertise includes the presidency, women in politics, a very apropos topic for today, and media and politics, another apropos topic for today. She's the author of numerous books, but I think the most relevant ones for our conversation today is Presidents and the American Presidency, Women, Power, and Politics, the Fight for Gender Equality in the United States, and In It to Win, Electing Madam President. Next, I'd like to introduce John Compton, who is an associate professor and chair of the political science department. His teaching and research interests include American political development, constitutional law, and religion and politics. His most recent book is The End of Empathy: Why White Protestants Stopped Loving Their Neighbors. Finally, I'd like to welcome Kyle Longley, who is a new faculty member at Chapman. He is the new director for the War and Society program and a professor of history. He recently joined us after more than 2 decades at Arizona State University. He's the author-editor of 9 books on topics ranging from US-Latin American relations to Southern politics and the American presidency, including LBJ's 1968, Power, Politics, and the Presidency in America's Year of Upheaval. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. Okay, I'd like to begin by asking you to each share some initial thoughts or observations on what we have all experienced or witnessed in the past week. And this is my question. What surprised you the most and what surprised you the least over the last 7 to 8 days? And I'm going to start with Lori.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, let me just start by saying that nothing really surprises me in politics anymore. I was feeling that way even before 4 years ago, but after 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House and seeing so many things go differently than we expected, there aren't too many surprises anymore. But having said that, you know, 2 of the things that really surprised me, I think, and one I know we're going to get to a little bit later, and that is I'm really amazed that any pollster still has their job in this country, because the polls just really got it wrong yet again. And, you know, the news media just keeps buying into the polling numbers and letting that drive the narrative. So there's a lot of questions about the credibility with that information. But again, I know we're going to get to that a little later. The other thing that actually surprised me, too, is that Democrats really thought that they had a shot in places that I don't think they had. I'm really surprised that Democrats thought that they could flip Lindsey Graham's seat to red. They could flip Mitch McConnell's seat. To blue. They could flip Mitch McConnell's seat. Also that they could flip Texas blue. Trump won Texas by almost 6 points. John Cornyn easily reelected. Both the state legislative houses stayed in Republican hands. I really think that Democrats were on a fool's errand with some of those races, especially with the amount of money that was spent. I mean, $108 million on the Democratic side to try to defeat Lindsey Graham, $88 million to try to defeat Mitch McConnell. I have a feeling they're going to want some of that money back now that they have these 2 runoff races in Georgia. And I think that the things that really didn't surprise me, really the split ticket voting that happened, because you know, a lot of voters were really starting to compartmentalize the way they viewed Trump. So there's Trump as an individual and his personality and some of the things that so many people dislike, but there's also the Trump policy, the Trump movement. And I think that some of the split ticket voting, how Republicans did better than expected, but yet Trump still lost, really suggests that, you know, people are capable of separating those 2 things out. And I'm also not surprised, although a little disappointed, that the Democratic Party, I think, still needs to recognize the Trump movement. This can't just be about moving beyond Trump, that they really need to recognize how we got to Donald Trump in the first place and what those 70 million voters represent moving forward.
Great. Thanks so much, Lori. Kyle, what's your thoughts on this question?
Well, I agree with Lori that there are a number of things that are not surprising. For example, I don't think it's any small, you know, the same coalition that has been the Democratic coalition since really 1968 is still the one that was victorious today. I think it's important to keep in mind that the Democrats have only lost 1 popular vote election since 1988, and that coalition tends still to be very strong. Now the Electoral College, which we'll talk about in a moment, definitely warps the sort of the process, but Biden's going to probably win by 6-7 million votes once they're all tallied. But that did not surprise me. It really didn't surprise me too much on where they were competitive. I mean, it's the same states that are being competitive, about the same 8 or 9 that are the most competitive in terms of the Electoral College. And that's where much of the emphasis. I agree wholeheartedly as a native Texan that there was no way they were going to flip Texas this time. The only way I think they would have flipped Texas is had a better Senate candidate like Beto O'Rourke, who might have got people a little bit more excited, but it was still going to be a long uphill battle. Now, what did surprise me is an incumbent president. There's been very few that have been driven out of office unless there was a third-party candidate to really throw a monkey wrench into the process. So you look at, you know, with H. Ross Perot in '92, the last time an incumbent president has been voted out, you'd have to go back to Jimmy Carter and John Anderson playing a role. So this time you really didn't have a third party playing much of a role, which is an interesting part of an incumbent losing. So I think that one really stood out to me. There's some other things that I think we'll talk a little bit more about in terms of the religion. The other thing is, I think highlight is the total number of people that voted. I mean, we're seeing numbers that haven't been seen since the early 20th century. And even there, that was very unique because it was primarily white males voting. This number of percentage of people getting out, getting actively involved, and the total numbers that Biden will likely win with are significant. And I think that's a healthy sign for our democracy. Now, later I'll talk more about why I think it was so close in some of the ways, and things like the people coming back at the last moment, and we'll talk about this when polling, coming back to the incumbent because they know what they can expect there. So I think those were, you know, there were some surprises, but I think there are also some traditional play. I don't see it as a monumental change in terms of the electoral politics that we've had basically in place since 1972.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, John, what surprised you the most? What surprised you the least?
Sure. I think, you know, Kyle and Lori have sort of already touched on my surprise and no surprise issues. I may flip the order a little bit, though. I was actually surprised by the amount of split ticket voting. So they're clearly better prognosticators than I am. But I would have thought the environment was so nationalized at this point that we just wouldn't see much split ticket voting, but we did. Not a huge amount, but in many districts, you know, 2 or 3 percentage, you know, 2 or 3 percentage points of people voting Biden for president and Republican for Congress or Senate was enough to, swing the district to Biden while sending a Republican to Congress. So I was actually surprised by that. And in some places like Orange County, we saw, a ton of split ticket voting. It looks like 2 Democratic congressional seats will be flipped to Republican in Orange County. Meanwhile, Biden won the county by about 10 points. And something similar seems to have happened in a few other places, like the state of Maine, for example, where Susan Collins was easily reelected while Biden easily carried the state. So it's been a while, I think, since we've seen that kind of split ticket voting. The thing that did not surprise me was, I think, the turnout level. The predictions going in where the turnout would be extremely high, and that proved to be the case. I guess, unlike Kyle, I'm not completely convinced that high turnout is always a positive sign for democracy. It could also be a sign that people believe that there are real existential stakes to an election and they have to vote. So part of me wouldn't mind seeing a kind of return to lower stakes politics where people don't feel like the future of the country hinges on the electoral outcome.
Great. So, John, you and Kyle have really focused a lot on the popular vote and the numbers of voting. But I think, as we all also have learned over this period, if we didn't already know this, the popular vote doesn't matter, right? We elect our president through the Electoral College. And I was wondering, last time we spoke with the panel, Trump had just been diagnosed with coronavirus, so we got a little refresher course on the 25th Amendment. I'm going to ask the panel to do the same thing here for us with the Electoral College. Why do we elect our presidents this way? And why are calls to do away with the Electoral College mostly ignored? And I'm going to start with the historian on the panel, Kyle, to give us the first answer here.
Well, I think it's very important sort of to set the historical context at the Constitutional Convention. This was one of the most contentious of the issues, and it was related to slavery, a fear of the masses. There's a number of elements, and there was a political scientist that wrote very well, and I'm going to just read the quote. He says, "By the end, they were tired, impatient, frustrated. They cobbled together this plan because they couldn't agree on anything else." I think that pretty much sums it up. Again, slavery was a major issue. The southern states were afraid of being outvoted, and this was a system to put in place that would give them a better chance. That's one of the reasons with the 3/5 compromise. So I think that, we look back to the Constitutional Convention, they gave us this, they were afraid of the mobs. They were afraid of, what some would fear as far as this populist leader that could just take control. And they wanted to have some checks and balances. Now, it has evolved over time in terms of how the delegates to the all or nothing. But the other point I raise, the last major chance to change the sort of nature of the Electoral College was in 1969. There actually was a congressional vote by in the House, 338 to 70, to forward a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College. Now, it hit the Senate, and Strom Thurmond and the Southerners killed it because they were afraid of the basic principle of one person, one vote, which they've been fighting against throughout the civil rights. But I do think there was this effort, in place. And what it came about, and what we've discussed before, is the Electoral College in 1968, which was a pivotal election. George Wallace almost threw a major monkey wrench. Richard Nixon was barely able to hit the 270 mark. And what would have happened if Wallace had taken enough and they didn't have a 270, it would have gone right to the House, where each state would have had one vote. So I think that's what scared them in 69. It did get some momentum. Evan Bayh was the leader in this process on the Senate Judiciary, and he would propose it up through 1979 with quite a bit of support from many areas. Now, whether it would have got out to the states and done well, I'm not sure. But there is a historical record here that says there has been questioning of the Electoral College. And again, if you look at the election since 1988, the GOP has taken the popular vote only one time, that being in 2004. The rest of the time, 2000, 2016, and now it may be moot now, but twice they've lost the popular vote and won the presidency. So I think these are all important issues to talk about, but the historical legacy is one that I think we don't have a very sound understanding of, and it only comes up every 4 years.
For sure. John, why do we elect our presidents this way?
That is a great question. The more I think about it, the more I've just concluded that the Electoral College is completely indefensible, whether we're talking about on a moral level or a practical level. As Kyle laid out, the original justifications don't really work anymore. The original compromises are not, how our politics are structured today. And so what often ends up happening, I think, is that people kind of reverse engineer justifications for it when it serves their interests. So you'll sometimes hear people say that it serves the interests of small states because they're slightly overrepresented, not nearly as much as they are in the Senate, but they're slightly overrepresented in the Electoral College. But at the same time, when is the last time that a presidential candidate visited Vermont or Rhode Island or Idaho or Wyoming? Doesn't really serve the interests of the small states to a very great extent. You sometimes hear people say that it serves the interests of rural voters vis-a-vis urban voters, but you have to remember there are a lot of rural voters in California and New York, states where millions of rural votes are just irrelevant. So I honestly, and of course there are other justifications that people give, but I don't find many of them very persuasive. And when you start to dig into how the mechanics of the Electoral College actually work, it gets even weirder, right? Because you're starting to see some people in Trump's orbit suggest that, well, maybe a state like Wisconsin could just have its legislature send a different slate of electors. If Biden's certified as the winner, but there are allegations of fraud or something, maybe the Republican legislature could just change the law and send, or in Michigan, maybe the Republican legislature could just change the law and send some Trump supporting electors. And then you have issues like faithless electors, right? In 2016, I believe there were 5 electors who didn't vote the way their states voted. If we ever have a really close election electorally, in terms of the Electoral College, a faithless elector could decide the outcome. So there are just so many features of the system that don't make a lot of sense. And the reason we have it is because the Constitution is very, very hard to amend. And so, I'll wrap it up with this, but there are other avenues out there, like the Interstate Compact, where if enough states sign on, I think 15 states so far have agreed that if ultimately they can get a large enough group of states that would control a majority of Electoral College votes, these states will all award their Electoral College votes to the national popular vote winner rather than the state winner. But so far, there are only 15 states who have signed on to this, and I think it's highly unlikely that there will ultimately be a majority of states that do that.
Great. Thanks so much. Lori, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm very much a pragmatist when it comes to this issue, so I'll look at both process and strategy here about why I think we're stuck with the Electoral College for good. In terms of the process, it's a really high bar to amend the Constitution. Short of a constitutional convention, 2/3 of the House and the Senate would need to agree to send it to the states, and then 3/4 of the states. So you'd need 38 states to do it, and then that's where we get to the strategy part. I'm not sure that there's really a sound argument for any state to agree to do that. A large state like California, why would they want to give up the influence that they do have in the Electoral College? Small states, it is the only representation they have, so I don't see a lot of incentive for them to do that. And then the swing states, nobody wants to stop being the place where everybody goes and campaigns and spends all that money on all the campaign activities and the ground game. So, you'd be hard pressed to point to one state who would come up and say, yeah, well, we want to do away with this system. There's also the possibility of doing what Maine and Nebraska do. But, that was discussed in California by the Republican Party. Well, the Republican Party's not in control in California, so they don't have a say over that right now. So there's just not a lot of incentive, a lot of strategy that would, that would make sense in terms of why we do it. So I think we're going to be with the Electoral College for quite some time, although I think the conversation about it will calm down just a little bit with a new president who won both the popular vote and the Electoral College.
Thank you so much. Okay, Madam Vice President. That has a nice ring to it. I see Lori. You can't. Lori's smiling. So Kamala Harris's election symbolizes many firsts for the vice presidency: first woman, first person of color, first child of immigrants. How did gender, race, and ethnicity end up playing out in this presidential election? And we're going to start here with Lori.
Okay. So I've been writing on the issue of electing a woman president for more than 20 years. I'm going to make myself feel even older right now by saying that, you know, and the very first time I voted in a presidential election was 1984 when Geraldine Ferraro was on the ballot. As an undergraduate at UC Davis, I actually, in the spring of 1986, and I remember, even though it was so long ago, she came to campus, gave a talk, and I was there. And I remember thinking that surely we'll do this soon. So it took until I was, 54 years old in 2020 before we actually elected the first woman president. And I will say that, both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, overlooked an awful lot of qualified women for many years. So it's hugely historic that we are about to see the first woman vice president sworn into office, and she's also a woman of color. And I think that in terms of this environment, Biden said he would pick a woman, and then by May and June, it was obvious that he needed to pick a woman of color. And I think the phenomenal thing, looking back over this entire campaign, is not only that he had so many qualified women to choose from, even when it seemed like he was going to pick a woman of color. But remember, a little over almost 2 years ago, there were 6 women running for president on the Democratic side. I mean, 2016 made history because there was 1 woman on the Democratic side and 1 woman on the Republican side. That had never happened before. So the fact that 6 women were running was truly historic. I was on record on our campus, off campus, anyone who would listen to me saying that if Democrats don't have at least 1 woman on the ticket in 2020, they deserve to lose. So I guess I was right on that prediction that it was going to be a really important year to do that. Now, having said that, what does that mean? It's hugely symbolic and it's very important, but just as when we elect the first woman president, the Constitution itself doesn't change, but just how we look at it and what that means to so many other people out there is really the thing that changes. So what we'll need to see is what Kamala Harris's role will be. We've seen the last 3 vice presidents, Pence, Biden, Cheney, all play fairly influential roles. I suspect that she will too. She will be an important liaison to the Senate, even though Joe Biden had spent his entire career in the Senate before he became vice president. He hasn't been there since 2008. So Kamala Harris can work with some of the newer senators and kind of be that important link to the Biden White House with what's going on up on Capitol Hill. She also bears a huge burden as the first woman in this office. She's going to set the standard moving forward. She also has an extra burden in that we just elected the oldest president ever. He's going to be 78 when he takes the oath of office. So is there a chance that we just elected also the first woman president? You bet there is. So there's going to be extra scrutiny on her to make sure that she is capable of stepping into the office if she needs to. Remember, the vice president is 1 heartbeat away. And so she's got a lot that is facing her, but this is a truly historic moment. And I know an awful lot of people out there are just, wishing her well.
Thanks so much. Okay, Kyle.
Well, I'm going to build off of what Lori has said and look at more along the lines of the gender related to masculinity. I believe fundamentally race played a significant role in this election and the outcome. You're still seeing, I think, traditional voting patterns there in terms of where whites went and where people of color went. Although I think there are some differences that we must examine, and that includes in the Latino community and even the African American community. And I think these relate more to sort of this toxic masculinity that is talked about a great deal today in terms of what Trump really represents in terms of what people perceive of as the masculine. And again, many will characterize it as toxic, others will say fragile, and others will just say this is just the cult of true manhood that many American men, especially, but not just men, have appealed to. And I think you see this play out in a number of ways in this election. I mean, how Trump talked about women, how he responded to them in terms, especially women of color, reporters. We saw this play out. How, you know, his affairs, his relationships and multiple marriages all played out, and you know, again, a different type of male character. And even the COVID itself, I remember watching a number of people talk about how Trump had beat the disease while Biden was hiding in his basement. And I loved one quote, and I've got this one, I just highlighted. One of the Fox personalities, a female, actually said about Biden, he might as well carry a purse with that mask too. I thought that one stood out to me as far as highlighting sort of how they tried to portray this. That Trump's the manly man, and Biden, you know, he is hiding. So I think COVID even played out a role in that. And where I think you especially see this sort of masculinity play out is in the numbers of Latinos that voted for Trump, male Latinos, and even the doubling of the number of African-American men that voted for Trump. I think we've got to explain it beyond race. And I think in this case, masculinity and it helps explain it a great deal. But it did have a double-edged sword, because I think it drove a lot of women directly into the arms of the Democratic Party, where you see significant numbers of African-American, Latino women in particular, voting in much higher numbers for the Democratic nominee. But you see it playing out a number of places across the country, especially the suburbs, where more white women, and even in, I don't want to encroach on John's expertise on this, evangelical whites, and they're saying about, you know, in a number of areas, 10 to 11% flip from Trump to Biden, and I would bet the majority of those were women, upset over sort of this masculine idea represented by Donald Trump. So I think the gender plays a significant role. It highlights, Lori's already highlighted a major part of the role, but I think also helps maybe explain some of Trump's popularity among, because he speaks his mind, he says it like it is. I heard that last night, even from a group of people who were his supporters. So I think that's another way the gender is playing out.
Yeah, we heard a lot about suburban women during the campaign, and we think about who ended up being in a sort of starring role on election night. Stacey Abrams also was somebody who really was pointed out as having made such a significant difference in Georgia. John, what are your thoughts on this question?
Right. Yeah. I mean, thinking about the role of race and gender and you know, driving the presidential results. I mean, I think one word of caution is in order, because the early exit polls are kind of notoriously unreliable, and so, you know, the internet and Twitter are already filling up with hot takes about, you know, which groups swung which way. And sometimes those change over, you know, the next 2 or 3 months as people really start to sift through the data, and as we get more reliable information from the states about who actually turned out and who didn't turn out. Having said that, I mean, some of the initial results, which Kyle and Lori have already touched on, are pretty surprising. One thing that I found surprising, you know, there does seem to be a pretty real gender gap, but much smaller than the polls were predicting. Some of the, you know, final polls, reputable polls before Election Day were showing something like a 20-point gender gap, where Biden was performing much better with women than Trump. Now, the exit polls taken on Election Day seem to show a much, much smaller gender gap. And in fact, it appears that white women as a group may have moved very slightly toward Trump by a point or two. So some of those predictions about the gender gap don't seem to have come to fruition. And I mean, the one place where it does seem that we saw real movement among a demographic group is Latino voters. In Florida, no one saw the Florida result coming, where Biden seems to have maybe only barely won Latino voters in Florida. I mean, performing something like 20-25% worse than Clinton with that demographic. And he apparently did very poorly with Latinos in the Rio Grande Valley area of Texas. And so I think Democrats do have to do some thinking about their long-term strategy. I think for many years, Democrats have sort of assumed that demography is destiny, and as the country becomes more diverse, their coalition is just going to keep expanding and expanding. But this doesn't seem to be the case, and they may have to rethink their outreach to Latinos in particular.
That's a great phrase. Demography is destiny, or perhaps not, not so. So you mentioned polls. How are we ever going to trust polls again, though, right? How did the polls get it so wrong this time? I think all of you have something to say on that. I'm gonna let Lori, who began us by saying she's surprised any pollster still has a job, to help us understand why did the polls get it so wrong? I mean, are these just inherently flawed? Is there anything that could be done? What's your insight here?
Yeah, so any of my students can tell you I've been on this soapbox for a few years now. I regularly tell them, especially when it comes to national polls in a presidential election, just ignore them. They don't matter. And John made a good point about the gender gap too, is that, you know, just like 4 years ago, there were these predictions that the gender gap was just going to be off the charts, and it looks like it really wasn't this time. You know, back in 2016, it was supposed to be something like 30%. By, you know, hearing a lot of my political science colleagues make that prediction. In reality, it was around 10–11%, which it had been for quite a few years, and it looks like it's probably going to be around that this time as well. So, you know, whether it's the actual polling going on in an election or exit polls, it's not that reliable, but exit polls, especially with all of the mail-in ballots, are just not really reliable this time. So I think that I'm going to put that in the category of national polls during an election. Maybe we should just not pay attention. But yeah, the methodology is still very flawed. You know, clearly there were just too many examples of oversampling of Democratic voters this time. You know, I mean, there were polls where I've heard people say, well, there was, you know, the sample of it was a slightly oversampled with, you know, but there were about 45–50% Democrats. Are you kidding me? What about independent voters? You know, I mean, the plurality of Americans in this country are still independent voters, whether, you know, they're in a state like California where you can be no party preference or you can actually declare yourself independent. You know, we tend to vote on the candidates, but we're kind of missing the point that a lot of Americans are rejecting the political parties. So many pollsters really need to rethink their methodology. I mean, there were a few polls that got it right. The final poll in Iowa, for example, had Trump winning by 7 points. That was pretty close. But one of the ones that was furthest off had to have been the Susan Collins race up in Maine. I don't think anybody really saw her winning. You know, she won by 9 points. There was a poll that had her down by 10 points a couple of weeks ago. That's a 19-point swing. What's going on in your polling, especially in a smaller state like Maine, if you can't figure out how to do this? The thing that concerns me the most about polling, it drives so much of the news media narrative. And if the polling is wrong, then the narrative that's being reported on is wrong. And the question I have, and you know, political scientists especially are concerned about this, although there's not a real way we can definitively know. But what is this doing to voter turnout? You can say, well, obviously voter turnout was up this year, but that's really more, I think, more because of COVID-19 and so many states, you know, expanded the opportunity to do mail-in ballots. So, you know, if polls are that wrong, how much is that affecting not only voter choice, but just the decision to vote at all? And so I think that's one of the things that we really need to look at moving forward for the legitimacy of our elections.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point of thinking about polling as maybe a source of misinformation that gets widely shared. And then you hear things which talk about, you know, you have the kind of well-established polls, but campaigns always talk about their internal polling, whatever that means, and to counter that narrative. John, you want to pick up on this? You were talking about polls before. I'm sure you have a few more comments you'd like to add.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know how much our audience knows about the mechanics of polling, but maybe just to sort of give the big picture view, you know, there was kind of a golden age of polling from the 50s to the early 2000s where everyone had a landline, everyone answered their phone. And so anyone with a random digit dialer could easily conduct a pretty accurate poll. It wasn't rocket science. But now no one has a landline, no one answers their phone thanks to caller ID. So it's becoming extremely difficult to get a random sample of voters, and the smaller the population you're looking at, the harder it is to get a random sample. So, you know, in 2016, when, you know, the polls were not actually maybe as wrong as some people think in 2016. At the national level, if you take the average of the reputable polls, I think they were only off by maybe 2 points on average in overestimating Clinton's support. But some of the state level polls were horribly wrong in 2016. And so, pollsters don't like to make the same mistake twice. So they adjusted, and most pollsters determined that the solution was to start weighting the non-college, weighting by education, basically, that they were missing non-college voters. So they all weighted by education, and in 2018 in the midterms, the polls were pretty decent, except for Florida. And they were way off in Florida, but everywhere else they were pretty decent. And now, fast forward to 2020, it looks worse than 2016. Meanwhile, everyone's weighting by education, which was thought to fix the problem. So we're sort of back to the drawing board now. And pollsters, I think one thing that's important to point out is you'll no doubt hear President Trump and his supporters claim that there's some kind of partisan motivation behind this, that the pollsters are all in league to help Joe Biden or something. But the weird thing about this is that we have plenty of evidence that Republican internal polls were showing the same thing. In congressional races across the country, it looked like Biden was going to do much better than he actually ended up doing in a lot of districts, and it looked like Democratic Senate and House candidates were going to do much better than they ended up doing. So Republicans' own pollsters were getting very similar numbers to what the national, media pollsters were doing. So it's honestly, kind of back to the drawing board at this point, and you can bet there's going to be several months here of, finger pointing and recriminations, and eventually pollsters will try something else, weighting by another variable, and see if that fixes the problem. But part of me thinks that there may be a kind of Trump effect, which is unique, right? When Trump is on the ballot, things seem to somehow become very inaccurate. And again, 2018 in the midterms, polls were pretty decent, but Trump's back on the ballot in 2020, and polls are all over the map. So remains to be seen whether not having Trump on the ballot will help to fix the problem.
Oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting interpretation. Kyle, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with John on that appraisal. The pollsters have had to try to factor in what they call soft Trumps or responses, where they won't say to a pollster that they're going to vote for Trump, but then they go in and vote for Trump. So I think there is some element of that. And I tie this, he gives us some unique elements, the masculinity issue, compare and contrast that to Mitt Romney, the previous one. I don't think Mitt Romney would ever inspire anyone to think of himself in the same way that Trump did, or portray himself. So I think the polls are limited. I think John also highlighted another major point, and that is the new technologies. These technologies of cell phones and lack of landlines, there's so many factors that can play out. But I would point out, I think that, in terms of the national polls, as far as the popular vote, it's going to be pretty close. The last ones I saw going into, just a day or two before the election were like 5 to 7%. And I think it's going to fall pretty much into that number. Definitely well within the error, the margin of error. But I think there's some other things playing out here too, and that is, I think it was hard for the pollsters to read the members of the GOP who were going to cross lines. I think we already talked about that. Someone asked a question about, Arizona, for example. I think that is an area that they're going to find a lot of the GOP switched at the top of the ballot, but then voted Republican down the ticket. Especially, I think, and this will carry over into John's next conversation, the Mormon community in Arizona with people like Jeff Flake, and of course, John McCain's wife, Cindy, played a substantial role in helping that process. So I think there's a lot of factors that play out, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think there's some unique characteristics, but in their defense, I think, again, at the end, they're going to be pretty close in terms of the popular vote. I think they're going to mess in terms of some of the electoral, but I think it gets harder and harder as you try to drill down, and there are some unique characteristics. So I think those are all things that we need to think of. But, the pollsters, they do have some challenges in the future. And again, I think a lot of it is because of new technologies.
Okay, so our chat's filling up, which is awesome. And I just saw our last question where somebody said there's a lot of questions, don't run out of time and not get a chance to get to some of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask one last question. Let's give quick answers to this one. And then I want to move into some of the questions, a lot of which have to focus less on what has just happened the past week and what is going to happen. Because obviously there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. So the last question I wanted to ask you, given the expertise of our panel, is about religion. It was striking to me as an American historian, the fact that Biden is Catholic was such a non-issue, because often in the past, quite often, the idea of having a Catholic president was a big deal in the United States. And here we didn't really see that playing much of a role at all. And we also heard a lot of talk about evangelical Protestants who turned out as a core constituency for Trump. So in the end, what role did a religion end up playing in the election?
Right.
And we'll start with John on that one. Sorry, I didn't say that.
I think increasingly politics drives religion rather than religion driving politics. If you go back 40 or 50 years, it was the other way around. And when we had our first Catholic nominee in 1960, Kennedy won something insane. Like, Kyle would probably know, but I believe he won something like 90% of the Catholic vote. It was just insane. That's a case where clearly Catholics were voting for a Catholic. Today, it's really more the case that evangelicals just are Republicans. They are dedicated Republicans, and there's zero chance that they're going to vote for a Democratic nominee. Catholics are a little bit more of a flexible constituency, and there's some evidence that that Biden performed a little better with Catholics, particularly in the Upper Midwest, than Clinton did. He may have cut into Trump's margin with white Catholics by 2 or 3 points, which could have definitely made a difference in some of those very close states. But I'm not convinced that those votes were really about religion. And in fact, if you look at the most devout Catholics, people who attend Mass weekly or more than weekly, they tended to vote for Trump. So it's really, again, more a case of, I think, politics driving the vote rather than religion driving the vote choice.
Great. Thanks so much. Kyle, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think I was going to emphasize the 1960 election where John Kennedy has to go to Houston, Texas, and deny that he's going to be influenced by the Pope. And I think it has changed. I think there's a number of things that changed. 1960, I think there's a major issue missing that is related to these cultural issues, and of course that is abortion. That changes a lot of the dynamic in terms of the evangelicals, as well as those Catholics that go to church more than once a week. And that's where he made inroads. Trump made inroads also in the Latino community, I believe. But I think there's one other thing to keep in mind. If you look at the Supreme Court today, there is not a Protestant on the Supreme Court. All the Republican nominees, with exception of one, Sotomayor, have been Catholic nominees. And I think there's been an interesting relationship between the GOP and the Catholic, especially the conservative Catholic. So if it did play a role, it was more in terms of where their positions were on abortion, school prayer, a number of other issues that are related, what they see now as religious issues, but are directly related to religion. So, they're moral issues, but related to religion. So I think that's probably where you saw it play out more.
Great. All right, Lori, last comment, and then we'll turn to some audience questions.
Yeah, just really quickly. I'll certainly defer to John on this topic, since this was what he did in his most recent fabulous book. If you haven't read it yet, make sure you pick up a copy. And just to add to what he said, obviously one of the areas where religion does play a role is that evangelical voters are very good at organizing on the Republican side and staying very focused on the importance of the Supreme Court. And that's something that Democrats haven't figured out yet, how to quite compete with Republicans on that. So, even though Trump is going to be a one-term president, he is leaving an incredible legacy in the judicial branch and 3 people on the Supreme Court, in part because of that support from evangelical voters in 2016.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a lot of questions on the chat about what happens between now and January 20th. And as you can imagine, lots of questions that are focusing on Trump's willingness to concede, or the fact that he has not yet conceded. And so I'm going to kind of group some of these concerns together, questions together for the panel here, which have to do with how legitimate are his lawsuits. What do we make of Pompeo's comments this morning about a, quote, smooth transition to a second Trump administration? So is there some sort of danger of a coup, I think is what one questioner asked. And how can we really know what's going on, given that there is so much misinformation circulating on social media, and in a sense people are rather siloed in terms of where they're actually getting their information from? So in other words, is this process going to end up being as divisive as the election it was? So rather than election kind of being the period at which then the nation comes together, that in fact we're just seeing a continuation. So that's a lot of issues, but I think it all kind of is umbrellaed under the sense that we have not had a concession from Trump, and so this lends another element of uncertainty to the process. So maybe who would like to jump in on that one?
I'll take that one as the presidency scholar on the panel. You know, presidential transitions are roughly 11 weeks, but we've certainly seen shortened ones before. George W. Bush didn't get that full time period before he started his transition. And one of the process issues right now is that until Trump concedes, you know, there can't be the money and government support that goes to the Biden transition right now to start taking care of some of these things. So I would say to everyone, don't automatically believe what you're hearing reported in the news media, because everybody's got an angle that they're playing. I think that there have been some reports that people close to President Trump are telling him, you know, you've got a little bit of time here, but then you need to concede. So I don't think we're to the point yet where we haven't really gone beyond some of the Republican talking points that are saying, of course, he has an opportunity to challenge these things, you know, and we're really not in that big of a hurry. I know it probably seems like that to the Biden folks who want the full government support to do this, but we're not at a critical juncture yet. So I think that there's still plenty of time. I mean, the electoral votes haven't been cast. That's the thing. People just assume that the news media have the authority to call the election. Well, actually, they don't. Constitutionally, it goes through the Electoral College. So I think that there's, you know, and some of these lawsuits may be dismissed very quickly. So we might get to the point within even a week where it's clear that Trump has to concede, and hopefully he will, and we can move forward. But a lot of things can happen in a presidential transition. And I think that like I said, we're still very early in the process, so it's not time to panic yet.
That's good to hear. Not panicking is always good to hear.
Yes.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more of a pessimist by nature, so I'm already panicking. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I guess I see this situation as a little more unprecedented than Lori sees it. I think, you know, we really haven't seen an example of an incumbent president claiming to have won. I mean, it's not just that he's claiming there's some uncertainty about the outcome. He's claiming to have won the election. I mean, as recently as, I haven't seen what he tweeted today, but as recently as yesterday, he's claiming that he won, and it's clear, and that any other outcome would amount to him being cheated out of his victory. So I'm not sure how Trump is going to walk that back, or if it's even possible to walk that back. And part of me would be surprised if he ever concedes. I mean, he may quietly authorize the GSA to start funding the transition or whatever, but part of me would be a little surprised if he actually gives some kind of a concession speech. And personally, I think this is a little bit of a dangerous place for a democracy to be in. And it's kind of a continuation of a trend that we've seen, you know, even that started before Trump, I think, of, you know, the political parties as institutions are pretty weak at the moment. Meanwhile, voters are very polarized along partisan lines. And as a result of that, you know, the weakness of the organizational weakness of the parties, there's really no figure in the Republican Party who can come out and say, okay, enough already, we have to kind of put a stop to this and move forward. And, you know, to this point, at least, no one has suggested that Trump dial back the rhetoric. And just this morning, I don't know if people have seen the video, but Mike Pompeo promised a smooth transition into a second Trump administration. He was kind of smirking when he said it, so it's possible it was a joke, but it's still alarming to hear a Secretary of State make that kind of a claim. So again, this may be my natural pessimism, but I feel like we're in a bit of a dangerous place at this point.
Yeah, if I can just follow up really quickly on that, and yeah, so I'm not as pessimistic as that. I have faith in the system, but and I understand that a lot of people out there are concerned. Well, when is Trump going to stop talking about this? Never. I mean, here we are. We're still expecting Trump to do something that he's not capable of. We've been doing that for 5.5 years now. So that's when he got elected, I kept saying, he's not going to be presidential. He's not going to do those things. Don't expect it. Everybody keeps expecting it. So, I think there are an awful lot of mechanisms in place that will make sure that things happen the way that they happen. And I don't expect him to ever walk back anything that he's ever said, because that's just not who he is. But that doesn't mean there still aren't plenty of adults in the room that will make sure that this transition happens and that we will have a smooth transition of power come January 20th. I mean, and bottom line is, if he and some of his staffers are still there come noon on January 20th, well, they'll officially be trespassing in the White House, and I'm sure the Secret Service will escort them out.
Kyle, can you weigh in from a historical perspective? I think sometimes too we look at the past through rosy lenses. We sort of forget about the political turmoil of the past. I always think of this when people say, "Oh, this is the dirtiest campaign ever," and you think, "Well, look at some of the campaigns in the 19th century." No, actually not. But what are your thoughts here about what the future holds?
Well, I think I'm sort of in between the two. First of all, I agree wholeheartedly. Trump has assaulted every democratic norm that we've known. So I think there should be some concern there that this assault on these democratic norms, and I'm not using the term for the party, I'm using for the long-term processes that have been in place. So I think there is some concern there that should be in place. But I also think I agree with Lori that these are things, there's enough processes. Now, that are in place, the sort of checks and balances that will help bring along this process. Again, I think the final numbers, when they're certified in places like Arizona, Nevada, in the disputed states, and he's already had his time for recounts. Once those are done, I think it's going to be someone in the White House, whether it's Meadows or whether it's Jared Kushner, they're going to step up and say, do you want to have a legacy? And if you do, this is where we need to go right now. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I wrote a book in which Al Gore wrote the foreword, so I know the Gore family quite well. And the impatience right now bears much less so than what was ongoing in 2000, where you're going to the Supreme Court, where we're discussing hanging chads. And I think, if anything, that one seemed to me more precarious. And ultimately, Gore did make the right or made the decision to stop the recount when he could have continued to push it forward. And I think those are all issues that we have to. But I've seen that one play out too. I was once at a presentation with Sandra Day O'Connor, and somebody had the audacity to ask her about Bush versus Gore, and she just went ballistic. I mean, she just went off on that person for even bringing that up and questioning her integrity. So I think there's some historical precedent there. I'm by nature a hopeful optimist. I'm hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. And I think that's what we've all been doing for a while now. Fearing that on the Tuesday of the voting, there were going to be armed militias out trying to intimidate voters. That didn't really come to being. So I'm hoping that as we move forward, some of those things that are worst case scenarios do not come to being.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so another question that I think came up in sort of different ways is what were the issues on people's minds? So we've really spent a lot of time kind of framing the election really as almost as a referendum on Trump, quite honestly. I mean, it seems that we're kind of pitching it here. But we have some questions here, like what are the issues that are on people's minds? This particular questioner is asking about the difference between individual liberty versus socialism. So I guess we get kind of a one viewpoint there. But obviously the election is taking place in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. We have concerns about the economy, and even in terms of seeing the way that different groups split, sort of regional diversities. And another question that came up here in terms of thinking about Latinx, the Latinx vote, which is this questioner points out was actually nuanced, because in Florida it really had a lot to do with Cuban Americans, and then of course Puerto Rican voters more going towards Biden, and obviously in Arizona it seems as if the Latinx community stayed strong for Biden. So even how we understand these communities, the issues that they're really suggesting are the most important issues are diverse. So what role did issues play in the presidential election, I guess is where I'm sort of going with this overall question.
I'll take that.
Oh, you want to take that one? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'll take that one because I've thought a lot about, I've studied the borderlands significantly, and there is a complexity there with the Latinx community. And ironically, the ones in the lower Rio Grande Valley, it was interesting, something was brought up the other day, how the Democrats thought that the immigration issue was going to work to their favor. But in reality, in that Rio Grande Valley, there were a lot of second and third generation going, we don't want these, and they were primarily Mexican Americans going, we don't want these Central Americans coming in. The other part that I found very interesting was the number of people in that area that worked for the Border Patrol, as well as worked in the prison industries there on the border, that were of Latino background, and how that shaped their whole view of the complexity of the issues. And of course, the other major one, I think, and that's just that one community, but it did play out differently in New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona, and of course, California than it did in Florida. But the other major issue that I think cut against the Democrats at the last point was the Comey nomination. Now, that did enrage a lot of people, but I do think it brought some of the evangelicals who may have been wavering a bit back to the Republican Party, and then made the courts the major issue that Trump could raise. But when it came down to it, the final statement, the reason Joe Biden won to a large degree was COVID and the Trump administration's response. I think that's the one that if we're going to go back and look at the polling, that's the one that is going to stand out most of why people left Trump behind. An incumbent, when incumbents typically do not lose. And, you know, you just ask without COVID what the results would have been, and I think the results might have been very different.
Thanks. John, Lori, anyone final comments on this question of issues?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with most of what Kyle said. I think that you have to look at this as kind of two different races, and at the presidential level, I think it really was simply a referendum on Trump. But at the congressional level, you know, Democrats, as we've talked about, really underperformed expectations, and so I think you're going to see a debate playing out within the Democratic Party. I mean, it's already playing out between the more progressive wing and the more moderate wing. And many moderate Democrats who either barely won re-election or were defeated are convinced that, you know, they were really hurt by the perception that Democrats had kind of embraced democratic socialism, or that Democrats were defined by the Black Lives Matter movement. And progressives, of course, have their, you know, have their rebuttals that in fact, you know, if the party had moved in a more progressive direction, they might have done better. So it's a debate that's been playing out for a couple of years now, and I think it's only going to intensify after Democrats lost seats in this election.
Great, Lori, quick comment, and then I think we're going to have to call it a wrap.
Yeah, I would just say that I agree. I think it was more of a referendum on Trump at the presidential level, obviously, and without COVID, I think we'd be looking at a second Trump term. In terms of how the issues played out further down the ballot, I mean, I just saw the news break that they called the Senate race in North Carolina for Tom Tillis. So with the Alaska senator, they're already at 50-48. And I think that, you know, I would give the advantage to both Republican candidates in Georgia right now on the special elections. So we're looking at divided government. And I think that, you know, that's going to probably force Biden to be more centrist than he would have otherwise. But I think that there really is a civil war looming within the Democratic Party, especially if Biden has to shift more back to the center to work with Mitch McConnell. What does that mean for the progressives in the Democratic Party, and where did they go from here? Because he's not a candidate who really focused much on issues throughout the campaign. He was really telling people that, hey, I'm not Trump. So I think that there are significant challenges facing the Biden administration from the moment he is sworn into office.
Thank you. Thanks so much to everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who's going to give some closing remarks. Tom, I think you're muted. I thought we were going to get through the whole thing without having to actually say that.
All right. You got me now. I know, of all people to do that, right? You know, you can hear me now. Thank you all for what a great conversation, and thank you to the attendees too for really a long list of questions, and apologies that we weren't able to get to those, but really it was a nice conversation on a really important topic, and one that I almost feel like we need to have it again, right? Another couple of weeks from now, because I'm sure the issues will continue. But I do want to thank you again. I want to thank Terrence Stroop, Amy Stevens, Adam Winton, Gregory Walsek, working in the backgrounds to help with all the logistics. This is being recorded, and we'll be able to post it if you want to send it out to others also. And then just one last pitch. We'll be doing another one, not on election, but on coronavirus, which is certainly something that is on everyone's mind. On November 16th, we'll be having our next Ask the Experts, so we hope you can join us. So with that, hope you all have a good day and take care.